Elevated horror isn't real. There, I said it. But let me explain what exactly I'm really saying about so-called elevated horror and horror for the past decade as a whole. See, I can still remember vividly watching Hereditary in theaters for the first time, being one of the first few movies that I had seen in a while to really shock me. Hell, I enjoyed it to the point that when I got home I ran upstairs and made a quick review on this channel, and it's not very good. Do not watch it, trust me, it's terrible. But compared to a lot of the stuff that I had seen at the time, it really did feel like something special. It had great acting, great cinematography, and an astonishing soundtrack, and it felt like a real game changer at the time. And at the time I really would say it was, but it also came with a term that would be everywhere for the next few years, that of course being elevated horror. That's because in comparison to a lot of other Hollywood films, it was extremely obvious in Hereditary that there was something more going on within the story. A similar film to elicit this reaction in modern context was 2014's The Babadook, as being more elevated in comparison to other contemporary horrors. Well, when you really think about it, in comparison to horror as a whole, are these films elevated so high in comparison to their contemporaries that they need their own separate subgenre / movement? Well, no, not really. That's because the term fails with three extremely important distinctions about horror and its history, which is that horror has always had meaning, the existence of arthouse, and its use as a marketing tactic. The misunderstandings of horror as a whole bring this term into reality due to these three reasons. But what exactly do these three things have in common? Well, let me fully explain. But before getting into that, make sure if you haven't already to like and subscribe to the channels for uploads every other Saturday at 4 p.m. on anything horror and horror related. Also, comment your thoughts on elevated horror down below and your own personal opinion on it before getting into my own. Thank you, and let's get back into the video. One of the huge misconceptions that comes along with the term elevated horror is that horror itself doesn't have some sort of intrinsic meaning in the first place. People try to use films like Insidious, Sinister, and The Conjuring as examples of horror films that have no deeper meaning and that they are just made for pure entertainment. But that misunderstands how films fundamentally work in the first place, as just because the film may seem completely straightforward in meaning doesn't mean it doesn't have anything to say. For example, take Insidious, which may seem like another jump scare fest of a film, but the movie itself is making a comment on family trauma and how that affects families from generation to generation. It does this with its ghosts being creatures from the families of past generations that have come back to haunt them. This shows that while family trauma may seem like something that is super tangible and just something that's relatively recent, it could go back decades, if not hundreds of years. Thus, Insidious does actually have a deeper meaning. Then there's Sinister, which follows Ellison Oswalt, a washed-up true crime writer who, in a desperate attempt to write a new story, moves into the house of a murdered family. He then finds tapes that lead him deeper and deeper into the rabbit hole that Bagul has dug, until eventually Ellison digs himself to the point where he cannot escape. In the desperation of trying to find Bagul, it has taken control of his daughter and then murders his entire family in cold blood. So while the story may sound pretty straightforward, Ellison represents something in our humanity that you may not have thought about. Essentially, Sinister is the old Icarus tale, as Ellison keeps digging himself deeper and deeper into the case due to his thirst for fame. But he in turn gets too close to the sun and burns up in it alongside his entire family. It's a commentary on the effects of greed and how it affects the entire family around him. He doesn't stop no matter what. He just keeps digging in more and more, despite him knowing that he's putting his whole family in danger. However, despite all this hidden subtext, people still repeatedly dismiss this movie since it's done in a more mainstream horror lens, focusing more on jump scares and atmosphere over anything else. This has been a common issue within horror for generations, with the 80s giving us the video nasty list and the 40s giving us the Hays Code. For example, films like The Thing, which is rightly seen as one of the best genre films of the decade, was originally seen as just a shallow gore fest that went nowhere by critics. Horror is one of the easiest genres to censor or ignore due to it being intentionally upsetting for some people. However, this view ignores all the layers and deeper subtext that are put more into traditional films in the first place. And don't take this as a defense of a lot of studio horror films like the Friday the 13th franchise, which was intentionally made to make money. However, those films have a time and place and don't automatically demoralize the subgenre as a whole, nor should they. But for some people, this creates the image of horror as a so-called lowbrow genre, though it could not be any further from the truth. Horror has almost always had something to say, and this sudden belief that has spread out of nowhere that it hasn't is a bit distressing to me. While you can have discussions on the PG-13ification of horror, saying that it has lost all meaning has been something that has truly baffled me. But with that being said, I think this step comes from a fundamental misunderstanding, which is, of course, people don't understand that this term has already somewhat existed before, but has an actual term to go along with it. That of course being the subgenre called arthouse, which are more experimental films that go against what the mainstream is doing at the time. This is where I think A24 style horror really fits, as these films generally experiment such as The Lighthouse with aspect ratio and lighting, and are more thematically focused such as The Babadook. However, this once again has existed in horror for decades now. In fact, a lot of the biggest horror films you can think of were considered art house at the time they were released, such as It Follows, The Blair Witch Project, and even The Texas Chainsaw Massacre. These films were essentially considered elevated horror of the time, but really just came to mean that these films were taking risks that a lot of the Hollywood horror films weren't taking. But unlike so-called elevated horror, art house has a very clearly defined line of what it is and isn't. As stated earlier, really the only criteria is lying outside of the mainstream, so many of these films aren't even that experimental, just doing some small touches that wouldn't really fly in the world of Hollywood. For example, a lot of European films such as Funny Games and Possession are labeled as art house, despite sometimes aiming for a wider audience than art house entails. But while showing that many of these films reside in the art house subgenre, let me explain what this completely devalues the term of elevated horror. Elevated horror, in short, usually is just the way of saying that it pleases critics and nothing else. Films that experiment aren't guaranteed to please critics, so the term elevated horror being used as one to describe horror films that try new ideas somewhat falls apart. Take Skinamarink, for example, which does a ton of experiments with how it's done, having nearly no dialogue and being entirely from cameras in a house. It is by definition an art house film, but has anyone tried to describe this movie as elevated horror? Well, no. Of course not. The movie, while liked by some critics, was ripped to shreds by others for being boring, and thus, if the definition was purely based off experimentation, then it should have 100% still qualified. But since people haven't been labeling it as such, this exposes the main thing wrong with the concept of elevated horror. And that is that it's not based off of actual experimentation, but rather just the objective opinions of a small group of people. And don't get me wrong, I am very much pro the idea of critics, as they help audiences decipher what they should watch and spend their time seeing, while also helping the artists get better at what they're doing. However, to say that their opinion judges what genre a film truly is a bit absurd and makes the whole idea of elevated horror somewhat fall apart. There is no true genre indicators, and instead comes down to the opinions of a small group of people going against the ideas of genre in the first place. And really think about art house films I listed a bit earlier. But when you think of art house films, these probably aren't the ones that come to mind, and instead think of more like films like Longlegs or Weapons. However, I disagree with this framework, especially for Longlegs, not Weapons. That one was intriguingly done. But with Longlegs, I've heard over and over that was the future of elevated horror, and I completely disagree with it, as it goes against completely the idea of elevated horror or art house as a whole. That gets into my next idea, that of course being this is by far the most infuriating aspect of elevated horror to me, as the majority of films labeled as such are just for marketing purposes and nothing more. They try to elevate their films so people want to see their films over the other ones that are seen as lesser quality. I saw this by far the most with Longlegs, as while the film didn't really do anything I hadn't seen before, it was praised as some sort of modern masterpiece. And honestly, the things that Longlegs did has already been done to the point that I could even call it somewhat cliche at this point. For example, while I praised the cinematography in my longer review of it, even that feels somewhat cliche within the context of the movie itself. See, after Hereditary, nearly every film marketed as elevated seems to follow the exact same rulebook. They all have flashy, impressive, low-budget cinematography, stories where the main characters are left in the dark of the horrible things that they are accidentally helping set up, an emphasis on atmospheric visuals rather than visual scares, and a metaphor for grief. I may sound like I am barking up a tree here, but seriously, think about it. I used to be excited for these types of films, but it has been done so many times after Hereditary that it's just gotten so tiring. And I think what infuriated me the most about Longlegs in particular is that it was so up its own ass about it. It pretends to be some intellectual thriller, but not doing anything to particularly set itself apart from the crowd. It quite literally is a shitty modernized horror version of crime dramas like Silence of the Lambs without any of the complexity and nuance that made those original films interesting in the first place. But I could spend all day just shitting on Longlegs, but I feel like reiterating that I don't dislike a lot of these films. In fact, many of them are some of my favorites of the past decade. However, I feel like using the term elevated horror sets a bad precedent for the horror genre as a whole and has created a slew of copycats trying just to get in on the trend. What makes horror one of the best genres out there is the unbridled creativity that it provides, and by limiting it by giving arbitrary elevatedness to a small group of it, we are limiting the possibilities of what others have to say. This marketing tactic has brought a breath of elitism into the horror subgenre, as it makes people think that their opinions on certain films are above others as they enjoy elevated horror, not what everyone else is watching. And while exploring art house horror is interesting and something I'd really recommend to nearly everyone, I think pretending that it is somehow above what everyone else is creating at the time, I think brings just wholly unnecessary negativity to the genre as a whole. And with all that being said, those three things really exemplify why the term elevated horror just doesn't work and why I think the term is just kind of bad in the first place. Those three things are, of course, that horror already has meaning, art house horror already exists, and that elevated horror as a whole is primarily a marketing gimmick. With all those things in mind, I think it's safe to say that elevated horror isn't a real thing and instead should be relegated to the area of opinion rather than seen as fact like some people see it. But that is all for today, so make sure if you haven't already to like and subscribe to the channel and let me know in the comments down below what you think. Do you agree? Do you disagree? This is all my opinion, so don't take everything I say here as fact. It's just something that I have noticed over the past few years. Make sure to let me know, and I'll see you all soon.